Good evening and welcome. My name is Dan Sakura, and I'm working with the Friends of Minidoka and the Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee to respond to the proposed Lava Ridge Wind Project. I'd like to thank Kimiko Mar and Tadaima 21 Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimage for this opportunity. I'm coming to you tonight from the Washington, D.C. area, which is the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway and Anacostan people. I'm here to talk about the Minidoka National Monument, which is a unit of the National Park System located in south central Idaho, which is the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone-Bannock Nation. Just one note about terminology. When I talk about Japanese Americans at Minidoka who are incarcerated there during World War II, it includes Japanese Alaskans. Those are people of Japanese and Alaska Native ancestry who were forcibly incarcerated, relocated from their homes, primarily in western and interior Alaska. Great, thank you, Kimiko. So I'm here tonight to introduce and talk to you with some great partners at the Idaho Conservation League and the National Parks Conservation Association about how best to effectively write public comments for scoping. This session is being recorded and the chat is being recorded. So if you're not able to watch the entire session or you want to share with a friend, feel free to do that. I'd also like to acknowledge my father, David Sakura. We're going to talk a little bit about my background and my connection to camp a little later, but my dad is very active in helping tell the story of Minidoka. He was a survivor of the camp, and I'm really grateful to have the chance to preserve his story and my family's story. In terms of tonight, we're going to hear from several experts about how to write public comments. But I just want to frame up the proposal. The Friends of Minidoka and Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee recently learned about the proposed Lava Ridge Wind Project, which is being sponsored by LS Power, a private equity company based in New York City. We were surprised by the lack of notice, and we've requested that the Bureau of Land Management, which is the federal agency considering the Lava Ridge proposal, to extend the public comment period. We were gratified this week that the BLM heard our concerns and decided to extend the public comment period for an additional 30 days. So instead of a September 20 deadline, which was the original, we have till October 20 next month. The Friends of Minidoka, Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee, and our partners encourage all camp survivors, Minidoka survivors and their descendants, as well as our partners in the Japanese American community and interested parties to participate in the public comment process. We have an opportunity for the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, and the Biden administration to hopefully understand what this proposal means to our cultural heritage and efforts to promote racial justice and healing. So with that, I'd like to go to the slides, please. So just a little bit about my family background. As I mentioned before, my dad and his family were in Minidoka. They've lived in Eatonville, Washington, in the shadow of Mount Rainier in Washington State. They worked at the Eatonville Lumber Company, and here's a picture of my dad being sent to Minidoka along with his two brothers. My dad's in the middle of the picture. Next slide, please. So this is my extended family in camp. There were 3 generations in this picture. My great-grandmother, Misa, whose husband, my great-grandfather, helped found the Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle. There were my grandfather, who is in the middle, and his 3 brothers, all of whom joined the U.S. Army on the same day. You can see my dad standing, wearing a sailor uniform in the middle, and my uncles in camp. Fortunately, they were not separated like many families were separated into separate camps. My grandfather did serve in the U.S. Army. I'm very proud of his military service, but I am not proud of the way the government held up the service of people like my grandfather and others to divide our community based on the loyalty questionnaire. Next slide, please. So this is a great slide from Densho's brand new Sites of Shame website. It shows the orange lines, the stories of people being torn from their communities, entire Japanese American communities being torn up and sent to camp. The orange areas, primarily Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, are where folks came from. You can see Minidoka there in Idaho. And then as the war was winding down, folks were allowed to leave camp early. Some settled in and around Idaho, in and around the camp in Idaho, because Idaho did not have an alien land law at the time. But other families, like my family, settled in the Midwest and in the eastern part of the United States. Next slide, please. So just to orient folks, we're going to start by talking about Minidoka National Historic Site. You can see this sort of square box in the middle of the picture. That is about roughly 500 acres managed by the National Park Service for the benefit of the American people. On the west side, there's a little kind of a squiggly parcel coming out that was owned by a landowner named Robeson. And about 10 years ago, LS Power sought to put a high voltage power line right over that property, which is right near the entrance to the park. That line is called the Southwest Intertie Project, and it would have significantly impacted the park. But thanks to the leadership of then Secretary Ken Salazar, the National Park Service worked with the BLM to move this LS Power SWIP line away from Minidoka to the west. I would like to point out that the Park Service, the park itself, includes only a fraction of the former campsite. The barracks blocks you can see in the background are privately owned in some cases. And you can see a little bit at the farm fields that helped produce agriculture and livestock to support the camp during the war on the green side. Next slide, please. So here's a blow up of a really wonderful map of Minidoka dating back to the 1940s. Enki Arai's map, Jerry Arai's father. This shows the farm fields and the livestock areas that were part of the overall camp footprint. That was much larger than the fenced area that included the barracks blocks. Next slide. So this is the historic footprint of Minidoka. You can see in the middle there the two wings of the barracks blocks. I like to say that Minidoka has a butterfly configuration with two wings of barracks right there in the center, plus the extended area for the agriculture in the camp. So when folks talk about the impact of the LS Power wind project on the historic footprint of the camp, this is the larger, roughly 33,000 acre historic footprint. Next slide. So this shows the actual wind project. You can see down at the bottom, Minidoka National Historic Site, and the roughly 400 towers are arrayed in a series of lines or strings of towers that start to the northwest of Minidoka, wrap around its northern viewshed and over to the east side, encompassing roughly 1/3 of the park's 360-degree viewshed. This would block the view looking north across the Snake River Plain towards the Pioneers. Next slide. So in terms of the National Park Service, after the monument was established in 2001, then Superintendent Neil King and Anna Tamura did extensive outreach to the Japanese American community in Seattle, Portland, and as well as Idaho locally. And they developed the General Management Plan, or GMP, for Minidoka. And the GMP provides the framework for the goals that the park works to achieve. The GMP also reflects the thinking and the recommendations of the Japanese American community, folks that had direct connections to camp, and is really your document. It's our document. It's one that reflects a lot of our priorities and thinking. Next slide. So the National Park Service, building off the General Management Plan, released a foundation document. And that foundation document includes what are called the fundamental resources and values. And the Park Service by law is required to manage those fundamental resources and values unimpaired for the benefit of future generations. Next slide. So in terms of Minidoka, here's a picture from the General Management Plan. This is looking north and east towards what would be the wind project. You can see the guard tower in the lower left. And the Park Service identified based on community engagement, a fundamental resource value of environmental setting. Minidoka's remote location provides an immersive setting that is fundamental to the visitor experience. Views of open fields and distant mountains create a sense of isolation on a vast landscape. Experiencing this environmental setting allows visitors to better understand and connect to the daily lives of Minidoka. Next slide, please. The second fundamental resource value is Minidoka is a site of conscience for commemoration and healing. This is a picture from the dedication of the camp during the Idaho Centennial. Minidoka, according to the National Park Service, Minidoka provides places for engagement, reflection, and healing. These sites promote connections to individuals affected by World War II exclusion, forced removal, and unjust incarceration, and serves to commemorate those who survived this difficult chapter in American history. For me, when I think about Minidoka, I think about my grandparents, Chet and Agnes Sakura. Unfortunately, when they were alive, they didn't really talk to camp life. It was, I believe, too painful for them. It was too raw, and they just never talked about it. And I'm sad because they passed away before the Civil Liberties Act was signed by President Reagan in 1988, and before the acknowledgement of Minidoka and the other camps as units of the National Park System. But I think the really powerful, the real benefit of Minidoka to our community, which has suffered such incredible trauma and pain, not just the pain of losing communities and livelihoods, houses, businesses, pets, friends, but the ongoing trauma that has spanned over 75 years, the trauma of shame, feeling a sense of shame, of feeling that you're the enemy. So this Minidoka, through pilgrimages and commemorative events like the Idaho Centennial Commemoration, helps heal those wounds and provide a sense of healing and helps us move forward as a community. Next slide, please. The third fundamental resource and value I wanted to highlight is public understanding and education. This is a picture of an 8th grade class field trip locally, a local middle school to Minidoka. And I see Minidoka and other national parks as part of the fabric of America's educational institutions, complementing elementary and secondary schools, learning about people of color and our experience, and also colleges and universities and online resources like Densho. With this, if this proposal goes through, it will significantly impact the park's ability to attract and ensure that people can learn from the experience at camp. Next slide. So this is the Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee, the 2019 annual pilgrimage. And I just want to encourage everyone to get involved in this process, to be engaged, to tell your story. It could be very painful, but it's very important that people making decisions understand what this site means to you. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our partners at the Idaho Conservation League. Ben Otto is an energy associate there, and his colleague Danny Gibson Webb is a conservation analyst. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for providing your expertise and partnership.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan, and this entire community. I'm really honored to be able to talk to you today and share our expertise on how to comment effectively on these proposals. So as Dan mentioned, I'm the energy associate at the Conservation League, and my job is to cause our Idaho power companies to replace fossil fuels with clean energy. But we at the Conservation League, we do that to protect the climate and the quality of life that we all deserve. And increasingly, we are focusing on the cultural connections to Idaho's environment and how they may be impacted. And that's exactly why I'm very, very excited to join you today. I got into this work and became a lawyer to help raise up the voices and stories of the most impacted but the least heard in society. And the most important thing I want to tell you today is that your story matters in this process, and that you all are already experts in your experience and your personal connection to the Minidoka site. I'm here to, in a hope to help you tell that story effectively so that we can influence the BLM's decision about Lava Ridge. So let me tell you a little bit about the Conservation League. And so as you see on this next slide, we are a staff, we've been around for a long time, since 1973. We're now up to a staff of over 20 people in 3 offices across Idaho. And our mission is to create a conservation community and pragmatic, enduring solutions that protect and restore the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the land and wildlife you love. This Lava Ridge proposal, it's an intersection of 2 of our 4 main campaigns, one that addresses climate change, and the other seeking to protect public lands and the cultural and natural values they represent. And so while moving to clean energy is necessary to protect our climate, we prioritize protecting natural and cultural values in Idaho. In full disclosure, when I started looking at this project, I didn't really know the details of the story of Minidoka and the incarceration of Japanese Americans. We heard a little bit about it, in the public school system, but I didn't know the whole story, and I'm a little bit embarrassed about that. So I'm very thankful to first be brought into this community through Holly with the National Parks Conservation Association. We'll hear from her from a little bit, and more through talking with Dan and Kamiko and Julie. I'm just really pleased to be able to share what we know and to help you all raise up your voices and get engaged. So let me talk a little bit more in the next slide about the project, where we're at in the process. We're going to then go into, based on our experience, how to fit your voice into this process in the most impactful way possible. So as Dan mentioned, this is really big. The Lava Ridge will be I think it's currently the largest wind proposal in the West right now, and it'll be among the biggest in the country. The developer chose this site because at first blush, it appears to have relatively low environmental conflicts. And importantly, there's a web of power lines in this area that gives this project access to the whole Western grid. So this is a regional infrastructure scale project, and that's kind of why it was the developer identified the location that it is. But now as we've learned more and we begin to check those assumptions, we're learning more about this project, both from the environmental side, but particularly on the cultural side and the impacts to Minidoka, and they're quite substantial. So thankfully, we are at the very beginning of the process. This is the perfect time to be engaging and getting your story into the decision-making process. We'll go into this in a second, but I just wanted to reiterate that this is the first step, and there'll be a variety of other opportunities throughout the next probably year or more to have more chances to weigh in, to have your values and your stories heard, and to influence decision makers. And the most important thing I want to leave you with again today is that you're already experts in your story and how it impacts and is affected by this project. There's a lot of other impacts and effects, but there's a whole host of people working on those things. We are connecting with some other communities like the Shoshone-Bannock tribe and the Shoshone-Paiute. We're talking with local residents, with county officials, with other wildlife groups, with other clean energy groups. But really in those conversations, I'm starting to learn that you all have some of the most powerful and impactful stories to share. So I really encourage you to put those in writing and make sure we get those into the written record. So this next slide will show you a little bit more detail. This is where we're at in the process. As you can see, this is really the first step of gathering public input. And we've already been successful in extending the time to put in some more input into the scoping process. Scoping is about filling the record with all of the issues that need to be considered and how they impact you and the values you care about and your experience with the site and the story that is encapsulated within the site. At later stages, we can dive into more detailed, technical, hard-hitting comments. Right now, we're just filling the table with all the possible issues. And as I mentioned, this is the first step. We think the rest of this process will play out through 2022, and we look forward to being engaged throughout. So this next slide, you'll see this is from the BLM, and this is actually from the scoping process that they're doing in this case. But this shows the wide variety of issues that will be considered in this process. And we've circled in red the one that's really relevant to this conversation. The traditional and cultural values and historical values that could be impacted by the project are just as important as anything else to be considered. So this is not hierarchical. This is not in any way, the colors don't mean anything. It's just trying to look pretty. All of these things are equally important. And so you can see, your story fits into this process. And so we want to talk about a way to fit that in the most effective way. We at ICL, we're worried about some other stuff. We're looking at wildlife concerns. We're looking at dust and roads, impacts to water resources. But all of these things will be considered and thought out through the process. We're really increasingly interested in the cultural and historical impacts, and that's not an area we know a lot about. So we really want to work with you all to learn more. But what we do know about is how to get whatever it is you're talking about in front of the decision maker in the most effective way possible. So based on that, we have some tips about how to provide effective public comments. Our team comments on these BLM or Forest Service proposals probably a couple a week. So this is based on our long history of trying to make it accessible for folks, but also impactful to the decision maker. The most basic tip is to just be yourself. Speak and if in some of the meetings, but most importantly, write in your comments based about what you know. You're experts in what you know. You don't need to be experts in everything. And you don't need to be overly formal. It's really important to just share at this stage, share your personal story however you best like to tell it. Dan talked about some of the fundamental values contained in the Minidoka management plan, the vast landscapes, the remoteness, the conveying that sense of isolation. So what the art of this is connecting your story, your experience to those values in the management plan, and then how the project proposal may impact or degrade those values or that experience. Now, again, it's not a formal fancy thing, but it's just a way to think about your experience, the value captured in the plan, and then how the project could impact that. That gives the agency, the decision maker, the material they need to work with. That's different than just saying, hey, this is a bad idea generally. You want to be as specific as you possibly can. And I want to really highlight that your pilgrimage experience and your personal family experiences with this site are again, some of the most important and impactful connections that I've seen as we've looked at this project. So sharing that is really important to get into the written record. The last thing I want to add is that style matters. And we experience a similar thing where, sometimes the agencies are doing stuff we don't like. But in this case, the agency, the Bureau of Land Management, is responding to Magic Valley Energy or LS Power's proposal. And they're in a tough spot, the agency is. They have to respond to this proposal. They can't just say no, they have to go through the process. But they also have to represent that whole range of values and issues that we saw on the prior slide. So presenting your comment in a way that encourages the agency, the BLM, to do the right thing, to take your issues seriously, and to factor those into the decision-making process is a great way to have it be heard and wrestled with by the agency. They're in a tough spot. They want to do the right thing, and it's the project applicant that's making everybody's life hard right now. Another thing I want to share is that we are working on some materials to help highlight the values and the requirements in the management plan so that you can use those in your comment writing. So I encourage you to stay in touch with us. The best way is through the Friends of the Minidoka committee. We'll be in touch with them throughout this process, but we'll be able to provide you some more materials so that you can make your comment the most effective it can be. This last slide is just the basics on the process. We have until October 20th, so we have some extra time. There's a link there to learn more about the project. You can submit your comment either via email or you can write it down and mail it in. Either way is equally valid, but it's important that you write down what you have to say. Even if you've said it before in a scoping meeting, now's the time to write it down and get it into the formal record. So again, I really thank you for inviting me into this conversation. You can learn more about our work at theconservationleague.org. But I really want to thank Holly Sandbo from the National Parks Conservation Association. She's the Northern Rockies Manager of Outreach and Engagement. And it was through Holly that I was introduced to you all. So now we'd like to hear from Holly about the great work that she and her organization are doing.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Danny and ICL for all of your expertise on this process. And I want to thank Dan for your work, your decades of work on Minidoka, and for sharing your story and giving a land acknowledgement. And then lastly, but not least, Kimiko and Julie for pulling this talk together. And thanks to all of you for joining today. Dan and Ben did such a great job of covering the fundamental resources and values of Minidoka and the comment writing process. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on Minidoka as a national historical park and how the National Parks Conservation Association works with communities and partners to ensure that national park sites are protected. So NPCA was founded over 100 years ago, shortly after the National Park Service was founded. We were created to be an independent citizen voice for the national parks. The National Park Service is a government agency, and they cannot advocate or take positions on issues that impact the park. They can provide information and they can express how these projects will impact the park, but they can't take a position on the project itself. So that's where we all come in. NPCA joins with communities and mobilizes advocates to fight for these very special places. Next slide. Dan talked about, and I think many people on this call already know, that these sites are not lines drawn on a map. They are places with harrowing histories and places that are deeply felt and people feel deeply connected to them. And as you can see from these images of Manzanar on the top left, Gettysburg on the top right, Minidoka on the bottom, and Chaco on the bottom right, that these are not islands. They sit in a landscape that contributes to their story and sense of place. And even looking at these photos, you can get that feeling. You can feel the isolation of Manzanar and Minidoka and the weight of the Civil War at Gettysburg and the long history of people who came before us at Chaco. All of these sites would lose that sense of place and history if they were surrounded by development at their park borders. So the good news is that MPCA and a wide variety of communities and partners have been very successful at protecting national parks like these from development right outside their borders. So in Gettysburg, efforts to build a casino just a half a mile from the battlefield were stopped, and that casino was relocated to a better location within the state. And 2 industrial-sized solar projects that would have been right outside of Manzanar have been put on hold indefinitely because of organizing efforts from the Manzanar Committee and their partners. And tribal nations and partners stopped the lease sales that would have opened up lands next to Chaco for oil and gas development. MPCA worked with all of these communities and groups to help protect these parks, and we're here to support the Minidoka community and the larger Japanese American community to protect Minidoka as well. Last slide, please. So the major impacts we're concerned about this project are the viewshed and light and noise pollution from this project. It's my understanding that at least 90% of the turbines that are in this proposed project would be visible from Minidoka. And so to protect this viewshed, and a viewshed means anything that can be seen within the park. And because this area in Minidoka is flat land, the viewshed extends for many miles. And also because wind turbines are such tall structures and it's a regulation for them to then be lit at night, we're also concerned about the light pollution that it will cause and impact this beautiful dark night sky that you can see here in this picture. So as Ben mentioned, connecting these impacts to the values and feelings of Minidoka is very important. And as we discussed, we will be sharing a document that helps everyone add these comments or add these concerns to their comments. And I just want to reiterate what both Dan and Ben have said, that you do not need to be experts to write comments. Your personal story and personal connection is very important. And that has already been proven. It was your stories and your voices that got the 30-day extension for this very beginning process, this scoping process. This process is supposed to be about citizen voices and especially about voices of those most impacted by the project. So we will continue to work with the Friends of Minidoka throughout the scoping process and beyond to ensure that your voices are being heard. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Holly, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. While we're waiting for some questions, I just wanted to add a couple points. First off, Ben, if you could speak, there was two public scoping meetings last week with the BLM. I know folks provided feedback in the public, like chat during that time, but could you clarify that those comments are not going to be incorporated in the record, and that we need to, what folks need to do, even if you did comment last week? So.
Yeah, it's really important that the agency needs a written record upon which to make decisions. And so that the comments, the scoping and some of the verbal comments that were given, that was really great. And I think that really helped getting the extension. But now we need to kind of formalize that. It's just the nature of the process that the BLM has to follow. That are written, getting your thoughts down in writing, even if you said them before, is really important at this stage. I want to take a second here to Dani Gibson-Webb, who's our conservation analyst. She actually sat in on a lot of those scoping meetings. So Dani, I don't know if you want to share a little bit of some of the more compelling stories or issues you may have heard that people might want to reiterate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ben. So I'm not just a head that's just watching all of you. I am a member of ICL. I'm on our staff, and what I jokingly tell everyone is that I'm Ben's calculator. So I bring a lot of analytical and technical experience, particularly in sustainability science, which takes both the environmental natural systems and compares that to how it fits within our social, economic, and cultural systems. So I'm very, very interested in all of these interlaps between cultural heritage and historic preservation and those sorts of things. And I'm very, very excited to get to work with all of you on this. So I remember in these meetings, I like sent an email to Ben while I was in it. I'm just like, I'm so overwhelmed with how much impact that this potential project could have on these Japanese American communities. And I was just blown away personally by just the snippets of stories that all of you were telling. And I know that has already had such a large impact. And I'm very excited to see how your voices can be shared and your stories can be brought to surface and really make a difference in this process.
Great. Thank you. A question that came up about the continuation of virtual meetings given what I call the Japanese American diaspora, that folks are spread across the country, and hopefully BLM will continue that during the EIS process. I also would like to recognize the really outstanding leadership provided by the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium. That's an umbrella group consisting of camp groups, individual camp groups, Japanese American Citizens League, Japanese American National Museum, and other educational partners. So that coalition has been really strong and key to our success, along with partnerships with groups like yours and hopefully other groups, because successful campaigns are won by partnerships and coalition and working together with multiple stakeholders. Okay, a question that came in about consulting parties. That's a really good question. So the BLM has to comply with two general laws. One is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which they're doing the environmental impact statement. The other is a separate law, but concurrently being considered, which is the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 106 of that act provides opportunities for people, groups like the state of Idaho, the State Historic Preservation Office, and others to participate in analyzing the impacts on historical resources. So folks can also request to be a consulting party, and that will enable you to receive information and updates while the BLM works to comply with Section 106 process.
Yeah, Dan, that's reminded me of another issue that's come up, is around the virtual meetings. That was a really great thing you brought up. But one thing that's really interesting to me is that the impacted community here is not just a community right around the site. It's actually all the way across the country. It's the whole entire diaspora. And so wherever you are in the country or the world, if you have a connection to this place, your story matters. You're not bound by geography. So I really encourage folks to weigh in on that and to explain that, wherever you are, you could be in Alabama, you could be in New York, you could be in Maryland. It's important for the BLM to continue to have virtual meetings and to have a really expansive look at the impacted community and to continue to collect those stories. It's pretty unique for this project, but it's really powerful.
Great. Thank you, Ben. A question came in about the position of Native groups, and we have reached out to the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, a sovereign nation located in eastern Idaho. The Minidoka site is on lands ceded by a treaty. We are very eager to work closely with the tribes, the Shoshone-Bannock tribes and the Shoshone-Paiute tribes of the Duck Valley Reservation, to respond to this proposal. So we'd welcome that partnership.
Yeah, if I could build on that for a minute too. We have a lot of connections with the Shoshone-Bannock tribe because we work on a whole bunch of things that are important and impact their cultural lands and their heritage. One of the interesting things is they are working on developing their own solar project on their own lands, so it's in the right space for them. And so we want to think about, that's an example of how do you respect the need to get to clean energy and address climate change, but to do so in a way that balances all the competing uses and stresses on the land. So it's another way to kind of build an allyship with a community, is to say, hey, maybe this project doesn't make sense, but maybe you have a project that does make sense, that could be an alternative to this proposal. So it's another area we're starting to explore with the local tribes and local communities.
Great, thank you. I wanted to mention that Tadaima 21 is having a session on Friday this week on allyships and partnerships with a very distinguished panel of leaders from the Japanese American community in historic preservation. And that is on Friday this week from starting at 6 Eastern, 4 Mountain, and 3 Pacific time. So if folks are interested in learning more about how groups work together and with communities, diverse communities, I encourage you to join the Tadaima session on Friday. One thing I would add about the impact of these towers is when you're driving around, you may see a cell tower that's maybe 200 feet tall. You may see wind towers off in the distance. These towers, because of technology, are substantially larger than existing wind towers. The top height of these towers could be as high as 760 feet. So to give you a sense of scale, the Washington Monument is 555 feet tall. The Space Needle in Seattle is over 600 feet tall. And the turbine blades that rotate are equivalent to the wingspan of a Boeing 747. So this each tower would be equivalent of a Boeing 747 spinning on the Space Needle. And also to give you a sense of scale, each of the towers is equal to 28 guard towers stacked end to end. So if you take a guard tower and multiply it 28 times, that's the size that we'd be looking at. There are 400 proposed towers, wind turbines. The closest would be 2 miles from the park. They would impact, they'd be located, some of the turbines would be located on the historic footprint in the park. And it would create a visual wall of towers that would be very difficult for visitors to experience, the sense of solitude and remoteness that people in camp experience. It'd be very difficult to focus on emotional healing, and very difficult to focus on, learning about the story of the site if there were 400 spinning 747s in your vision or in the immediate background of the site. Question for Holly. What are the key takeaways from the Manzanar Solar Project that you see would be good lessons learned for the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I think importantly that there's a slight differences between those two projects in that this is a federal project on federal land, and that was a Los Angeles city project on, I think, county land or city land. So the processes are a little different, but I think the key takeaway, and we're focused on this call with NEPA, and it's very important for everybody to participate in NEPA and get their comments in. But the key takeaway I would say from the Manzanar Solar Project is that there's also a political fight to be had and a lot of communication to get out into the community. There were a lot of people writing op-eds. There were a lot of people getting their stories out in that way through radio, through the newspapers. And I think the good news is that you have an amazing organizer in Dan, and Dan knows how to do this work. And I know he's already started doing this work and he's already working on that. So the National Parks Conservation Association is here to support you in those efforts. However, you want to move that political, outward-facing public campaign.
Great, Holly. Thank you so much. Question came in about how to support Minidoka without being against renewable energy. And let me acknowledge that our world faces an existential threat from climate change, and that communities across the United States are suffering directly from climate change, whether it's wildfires out west or storms like in the east, the tragedies of entire communities being erased by wildland fire, or people drowning in their apartments, in basement apartments. Those impacts are real. Renewable energy is vital in moving forward to address those impacts. However, we, the Japanese American community, we're not against renewable energy. We support renewable energy, but it's a question of where it should be. So I have solar power in my house. I have solar panels on my roof, and that's the right place for solar panels to be on my roof. That doesn't mean that solar panels should be everywhere. For example, in cemeteries or in the Viewshed of Flight 93 Memorial. Wind power is critically important. We need it, but we need to make smart decisions, and we're hoping that the Bureau of Land Management will take a balanced approach to public land management and not have one user or one proposal completely destroy the cultural and historic value of Minidoka as a place of healing. And we hope that the BLM won't allow LS Power to damage and destroy the value of Minidoka and desecrate the memory of our ancestors and destroy the site as a place of learning and healing for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, Dan, if I could add a little bit to that it's something I worry about every day. And because, Dan appropriately said that we're facing somewhat of a crisis, but we can't sacrifice the things that we care most about, our cultural values, our environmental values. So there's a lot of stuff you can do at home. Like, we spend a lot of time building up energy conservation programs and promoting those and getting people to participate so that we can reduce the total amount of power that we need. Then we spend a lot of time thinking about distributing those resources on rooftops, old mining sites, industrial facilities. There's a lot of really degraded lands that that are more appropriate for siting clean energy or projects. So there's a variety of ways. It's not just this one project that is the make or break for climate. There's a ton of places that are appropriate. So have confidence that you can do the right thing in a lot of places, both in your personal life, in your community, and in other projects. But if there's one project that really doesn't strike that right balance, it's fine to say, nope, not here. And that's something that we do every day. And it's the right way to approach this.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So in terms of next steps and learning, we encourage people to check the Friends of Minidoka website, the Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee website. There will be updates on both of those sites. Please continue to check the BLM public comment webpage. Sometimes they will have updates there. If folks have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer questions or see if I can steer folks in the right direction. I also would like to acknowledge the really outstanding work of the National Park Service, standing up for our stories, to ensure that our voices are heard. And I'd commend the park superintendent for a recent letter that he sent, providing information on the impact of the proposal on the Minidoka National Historic Site. So October 20, that's the big day. Please mark your calendar. And I also want to encourage folks to think about, we talk about an environmental impact statement, an EIS. Well, I'd like folks to think about sort of an emotional impact statement. And I know it's very painful. We all have very painful stories in our families. A lot of folks, it's hard to talk about those stories. It's hard to kind of relive what happened. I know for many people, it's still very raw. I know it is for me, what happened. It's exacerbated by the epidemic of anti-Asian violence recently. So, but I would encourage people to really think about our story. This is hallowed ground for the Japanese American community. This is where people suffered. This is where people persevered. This is where people died in camp. This is where families were broken in pieces. This was where communities were divided by the government into sort of loyalty or loyal, taking the loyalty oath, who is good and who is bad. And this shame, this trauma has continued for over 75 years. And we need this park to help us move forward, to help the community move forward, and help the country understand that anti-Asian violence and hatred is not new, so that we can better address it and move forward as a country. We're gratified by the Biden administration's commitment to environmental justice, to racial healing, and we're hoping that this project can be modified in order to be consistent with those goals of this administration and the secretary. Question that came in: does Idaho have several wind turbines as well as solar farms? Are they on private or state or federal land? Or no, Ben, if that might be one for you. So
yeah, for sure. There's about a dozen wind projects and about a dozen solar projects. They're all on private land, and that's actually a great spot. They're in good places. They're on largely on old agricultural land that was taken out of production because there was no more water. And so the owners of that land, the people who lived there, were able to find a new revenue stream and put up some wind towers with really low environmental conflicts and able to keep the family farm in the family. Some of the pictures that we showed earlier in the presentation are from those types of projects. This will be the first major federal land sited renewable project in Idaho. So it's having a little extra, well, not a little, a whole lot of extra process and consideration and a lot of different values.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And then the existing wind farms people have in their mind, I mean, they've been around a long time. I guess the size of these towers is growing, with technological advances, they're getting, taller. Could you speak a little bit to the, what you see versus what this proposal looks like? Or
yeah, I can. The wind projects that were built in Idaho were in about the 2009 to 2012 timeframe, and they're a couple 100 feet high. And at that time, they were kind of state-of-the-art technology. But as wind power has been developed all over the world, like everything, it just gets bigger, right? And so these new towers are enormous. These will be among the tallest in the U.S. This is a whole new generation. And the idea is that you can have, fewer towers and get that produce more energy. So maybe you have, maybe less impact, but you're getting so tall and so big that I think that balance might be a little bit of a misnomer. Danny, from your reading of the documents and materials, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't think a ton. Okay. I know that with this Lava Ridge project, they've given like a range. And so they say that they can have they're proposing up to 400, and they can be up to 750-ish feet tall. And so it's definitely, I think, flexible based on input. I know that with the meetings that we have had previously with LS Power, they're very receptive to feedback. So perhaps by giving back really constructive feedback, they can find a better location or something of the sort. So,
yeah, good point.
Great. Well, just want to see if there's any more questions or any more last comments.
I did see one about the process. So just to remind folks again, right now to October 20th, it's called scoping, and it's really just like tell your story, get it into the written record, fill up the table, fill up the hopper with all the issues to be considered. The next step is the BLM will then take all those comments and start developing their environmental impact statement. So they'll have to wrestle with all of those comments, the impact to the whole range of values. They'll consider a range of alternatives to the proposal. And one of those is no action. Hey, we should say no. That environmental impact statement will come out in a draft form. We'll all have an opportunity to critique the analysis, to provide some more input. There'll be another round and a final impact statement, and then we'll have another chance to engage there and critique and analyze that final statement. And then it'll go into kind of the formal agency decision. And all of this is leading up and building the record and building the story and building the analysis throughout that process. So right now we're at scoping. That will then go into analysis. We'll get to comment on that analysis. We'll get to comment on a refinement of that analysis, and then we'll finally see a final decision.
A really concise way to think about it is that scoping is us telling everyone what we want them to analyze. And so then they'll take the time and they'll analyze it. And then we get to review that analysis and then provide whether we like that analysis and we like those things or not.
Well said.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Holly, do you have any last comments or feedback?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I just having a little bit of moment to think about kind of the Manzanar question, and just a campaign question in general is just, I think the success of Manzanar and other campaigns was also that I think it was called the Owens Valley Committee, and it was a group of ranchers that were concerned about the project, also partnered with the Manzanar Committee, along with groups like ours that were conservation groups. And so I think the success of campaigns is having a wide variety of groups involved that have a wide variety of concerns and issues. And I know Ben has already brought it up, how many people they're talking to, and I know Dan's talking to other people too. So if the Friends of Minidoka wants to just keep building its allies and partnerships, I think that is the key to success.
Great. Thank you. Yes, we are very open to partnering. And a question that came in about the formal agency decision. So Ben, do you want to talk about sort of the record of decision and final agency action that potentially could be subject to judicial review?
Yeah, so this is, technically the decision maker here is the Shoshone Field Office of the Bureau of Land Management, and that's a federal employee. This is a federal permit. I think that this project is so big and some of the issues are so large that this will probably start moving up the chain of the Department of Interior. That's the federal agency that BLM operates within. So there'll be some, I'm sure, some review at that higher level. This is a big deal. But yes, this is a federal decision. And so then that will become what's the last step is called the record of decision. That's the formal decision document by the federal official, at which point, if you disagree with that, you start thinking about going to federal court and challenging that decision.
Great. Thanks, Ben. That's really helpful. And I just want to close by sharing a little bit of history about a remarkable leader in American history, and that is Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, who served in the cabinet of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Secretary Ickes and Eleanor Roosevelt, in terms of the FDR administration, were probably our two greatest champions. Initially, the War Relocation Agency started off as an independent agency. It wasn't part of another department, and there were some, very difficult management decisions and challenges. And Secretary Ickes went to the president and said, look, there's some problems at the WRA. And FDR later decided, well, let's put Harold Ickes, secretary, in charge of the WRA. And Secretary Ickes was a remarkable leader on civil rights and racial justice. And he then helped manage the WRA in a very enlightened way. And we owe a debt of gratitude to Secretary Ickes for his leadership in terms of the Japanese American community. So But with that, I'd like to close it out and thank you all, Ben, Danny, Holly, your organizations, for your time for the second session today and your commitment to work with us going forward. So we very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
It's been fantastic. And I look forward to more.
Great. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.